As you may remember, the peripheral nervous system includes the cranial and spinal nerves and is divided into the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system. This chapter looks at the autonomic nervous system. Let's now look at a number of principles that relate to the autonomic nervous system, and in this section we'll also compare the somatic nervous system with the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is that system that most people are familiar with. The somatic nervous system involves sensory messages that are sent from the somatic senses, such as touch, and special senses, such as vision and hearing. The motor messages of the somatic nervous system are messages that go to the skeletal muscle and cause voluntary movements. The autonomic nervous system is less familiar to most people because it is self-governing, as the name implies, autonomic or autonomy. It sounds like the word autonomy. An autonomous organization is a self-governing organization. So the autonomic nervous system is a system that governs itself. In other words, you really don't have conscious control over it. The activities of the autonomic nervous system occur automatically. There are both sensory and motor neurons in the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic sensory neurons are associated with interoreceptors. These are sensory receptors that are found in the blood vessels, the visceral organs, and the muscles. And the purpose of the autonomic sensory neurons is to monitor the internal environment. So for instance, there are interoreceptors that are specifically chemoreceptors that are constantly monitoring the level of CO2 in your blood and then telling your body to respond accordingly if it's too high or too low. There are also mechanoreceptors that are monitoring the degree of stretch in the walls of organs and in blood vessels. And the messages sent by the autonomic sensory neurons are usually not consciously perceived. In other words, these sensory messages are being sent automatically, and you're not aware of these messages that are being sent. The autonomic motor neurons regulate visceral activities, that is, internal organ activities, by either increasing or decreasing their physiological activities. The physiological activities are those of the cardiac muscle, the heart, smooth muscle, which is found in a variety of locations, for instance your digestive tract, and there's smooth muscle around blood vessels, and also some glands. There are two divisions of the motor portion of the autonomic nervous system. These are called the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. We'll spend a lot of time talking about each of these divisions a little bit later on and see where they are structurally in the nervous system and the difference between them functionally. Let's now compare the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system in a little more detail. In the somatic nervous system, there's one motor neuron in the pathway. In other words, when a skeletal muscle contracts and we look at one particular neuron that is innervating that skeletal muscle, we would see that from the time that that motor neuron leaves the central nervous system until it gets down to that muscle, there's only one motor neuron in the pathway. We don't have a whole series of motor neurons, one right after the other, until we finally get down to the skeletal muscle. Again, whenever a skeletal muscle is stimulated to contract, and we were to follow one neuron from the time that it leaves the central nervous system until we get down to that skeletal muscle, we would see that there's only one neuron in the pathway. You might remember that when we talked about the muscular system, we learned that acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that's released from the motor neurons and that stimulates the skeletal muscles. On the other hand, in the autonomic nervous system, there are two motor neurons in the pathway, at least usually, and we'll talk about that exception a little bit later on. You'll remember that the autonomic nervous system stimulates glands, cardiac muscle, of course in the heart, and smooth muscle, for instance in the urinary bladder. And as we can see from this diagram, there are two motor neurons in the pathway. From the time that the message leaves the central nervous system until it gets down to those effectors, there are two neurons in the pathway. We can see that there's one here, and then it synapses with another neuron, and then that neuron sends a neurotransmitter to the organ. The two neurons that are in the pathway are called a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. You can see that the preganglionic neuron synapses with the postganglionic neuron at a location called an autonomic ganglion. You might remember that a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies, and we'll look at the anatomy of all this in more detail a little bit later on. In some cases, there isn't a second motor neuron. Rather, the first motor neuron extends into the adrenal medulla. This is the inner portion of the adrenal gland. And as we can see, the adrenal medulla secretes the chemicals epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is otherwise known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine is otherwise known as noradrenaline. Another difference that we can see between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system are the neurotransmitters that are released. In the case of the somatic nervous system, it's acetylcholine that stimulates skeletal muscle. In the case of the autonomic nervous system, there's two kinds of neurotransmitters that will stimulate the effectors. In some cases, it's norepinephrine, and in other cases, it's acetylcholine. We did see, though, that also the adrenal medulla also secretes epinephrine. You can also see that the preganglionic neurons will release acetylcholine.